They say a father is a daughter's first hero, but my hero died the same day my mother closed her eyes. The man left behind, the one I called father, became my jailer. On my 15th birthday, he took away my school and gave me a new education at the Blue Moon, a roadside bar where desperation, sweat, and cheap perfume blended into one. He said, "You will learn how this world really works." And I learned. I learned how the town's respectable men hid their secrets, how women sold their smiles, and that everything in life has its price. But my father taught me too well. He never expected that the final lesson I learned was how to burn his entire world to ashes. If you are listening from anywhere in the world, please leave a comment and subscribe, because there are truths that need to be spread, even if they shake your beliefs. There are stories, no matter how painful, that must be told. Back in Mentone, we lived in a small house painted light blue with a yard that seemed endless to a child's eyes. My father, Frank Thompson, worked as an accountant in an office in the center of town, always in a suit and tie, even on the hottest days. He was a tall man, with broad shoulders and large hands, with a mustache that he trimmed rigorously every week. My mother, Clara Peterson Thompson, was an elementary school teacher, the kind who taught all subjects. She had brown hair, always tied in a bun, and a smile that lit up any room. It was just the three of us. Mom had lost 2 babies before me, and the doctors said she couldn't have any more children after my birth. So I grew up being the center of attention, especially for my mother, who showered me with kisses and told me stories every night before bed. Our house was on a dirt road, away from the center, but close enough for Mom to walk to the school where she taught. The yard had a pecan tree that produced the sweetest nuts I've ever tasted, a swing that Dad hung from a strong branch of an oak tree, and a little corner where Mom grew herbs for teas and seasonings. I think that's where I started to like plants. When I was little, around 6 years old, our life seemed perfect. In the morning, Mom would get me ready for school, braid my hair, and give me a kiss on the forehead before we left together. She would drop me off in my classroom and continue to hers. At recess, I would sometimes find her in the yard, and she always saved an apple or a piece of cornbread for me. Dad left earlier and came back when the sun was already low. Back then, he still smiled. I remember him arriving with his coat over his shoulder, picking me up in his arms and spinning me in the air. "How was Daddy's Princess's Day?" he would ask. And I would tell him everything, from the lessons to the games at recess. On winter nights, which are quite harsh in Mentone, the biting wind comes down from the mountains and seeps through the cracks in the windows. We would gather around the wood-burning stove. Mom would make us all hot chocolate, while Dad told stories from when he was young, of how he met Mom at a town festival dance, and how he fell in love with the way she danced. My favorite games were playing school, of course. I would line up all my dolls and teddy bears in my room and give classes just like I saw Mom do. I had a small chalkboard that I received for Christmas, and I spent hours writing and drawing on it. I also liked to play in the yard with the neighborhood kids, especially with Charlotte, who lived in the house across the street. We climbed trees, played house with leaves and dirt, and hid secrets inside holes we dug near the fence. But when I was 9, things started to change. Mom started to get sick. At first, it was just headaches that she disguised with a weak smile. Then it was whole days in bed with the curtains drawn because the light hurt her eyes. Doctors came and went from the house, always with serious expressions, speaking in low voices with Dad in the living room. It was around that time that I noticed the first change in Dad. His smile began to disappear as if a little piece of him died each day without Mom's joy. He also started coming home later from work, smelling of cigarettes and sometimes alcohol. The stories around the stove ended. The questions about my day at school became rare. One winter morning, when frost covered the yard like a crystal carpet, Mom didn't wake up. I remember the commotion in the house. Aunt Josephine, Dad's sister, taking me to her house, the neighbors coming and going, the whispered voices and sad glances. I remember the dark wooden coffin in the living room, the white flowers, the candles, and not understanding why Mom seemed to be sleeping, but no one was waking her up. It's a chilling moment when a child's world breaks in two. Kathy didn't just lose her mother. In that moment, she lost the father she knew as well. Stay with us to see the shadow he becomes. After the funeral, Dad changed completely. The affectionate man who used to spin me in the air disappeared. In his place was a quiet shadow, who spent his nights staring into space with a glass in one hand and a cigarette in the other. Aunt Josephine stayed with us for a few weeks, cooking, taking care of the house and me. But she had her own family, and one day she left too. It was just me and Dad in that house that seemed to have grown bigger after Mom was gone. The rooms were the same, but they felt empty, cold. The wood-burning stove was rarely lit, and meals became silent. I still went to school, but now I walked alone, with my hair ribbons crooked because I had to tie them myself. Little by little, I started taking on some household chores. I learned to wash my clothes, to make rice and beans, to sweep the floor, not by choice, but by necessity. Dad was there physically, but his mind seemed to be somewhere else. When he looked at me, I sometimes had the impression that he saw Mom's face in mine, and that seemed to hurt him even more. It was when I turned 12 that I noticed another change. Dad started to dress up more, putting on cologne before leaving. Sometimes he wouldn't come home at night. He said he had extra work, but his eyes avoided mine when he said that. I started hearing rumors at school, whispers from other children. "Your dad works at that place now," they would say, never finishing the sentence. I didn't quite understand what was happening, but I felt that something was wrong. The bills began to pile up on the kitchen table. The money that used to be enough for our needs now always seemed to be short. I had to quit my piano lessons, which were my only joy at the time. And Dad, once so proper and punctual with his commitments, now seemed not to care. And it was in this setting of a house empty of affection and full of silences that I entered adolescence without a mother's guidance, with a father who grew more distant every day, and with a knot in my chest that seemed to grow with each anniversary of Mom's death. On my 15th birthday, on a sweltering afternoon in June of 1961, there was no cake, no candles, no congratulations. Dad came home earlier than usual, which was already strange. He entered the house, took off his coat, and hung it carefully on the chair. I was in the kitchen trying to make something for dinner. "Kathy," he said, lighting a cigarette with that silver lighter he had carried for as long as I could remember. "From today on, things are going to change." I looked at him, confused. His eyes, which were once gentle like Mom's, now seemed as hard as river stones. There was a strange glint in them, something that mixed determination and desperation. "You're not a little girl anymore," he continued, blowing smoke through his nose. "And it's time you learned how the world really works." He told me I would no longer go to school, that the education I was receiving there was useless for real life. I tried to argue, telling him I liked to study, that I wanted to be a teacher like Mom. But he slammed his hand on the table, making the silverware jump. "Don't argue with me," he shouted, and for the first time, I felt real fear of my own father. "Starting tomorrow, you're coming to work with me. You're going to learn a real trade." That night I couldn't sleep. I kept imagining what kind of work it would be. Dad was an accountant, at least that's what I thought. Maybe he wanted to teach me how to handle numbers, ledgers, but why would that require me to leave school? The next morning, he woke me before sunrise. "Put this on," he said, tossing a dress onto my bed. It was a simple dress, made of cheap fabric, but it was clean and ironed. I had never seen it before. When we left the house, the sky was still dark. We walked in silence through streets I didn't know, moving further and further away from the center of Mentone, entering an area of town I had never been to. The houses became more sparse, then some warehouses appeared, and finally, we arrived at a large, dark, wooden building with a faded sign that read, "The Blue Moon." "Is this a bar?" I asked hesitantly. Dad didn't answer. He took a bunch of keys from his pocket, removed the padlock, and opened the door. The smell was the first thing that hit me. A mixture of cigarettes, spilled liquor, cheap perfume, and something else. A smell that I would only later identify as the scent of human desperation. This is the moment her childhood was officially murdered. Her father promised to teach her how the world really works, but this education is a prison. Keep listening to see what she's forced to learn inside the Blue Moon. Inside, There was a long, dark wooden bar, round tables scattered around the room, and in a corner, a small stage with a faded red curtain. The place was empty and silent, but somehow it seemed to hold echoes of voices, laughter, music. "This," Dad said with a gesture that took in the whole room, "is my business now." I was speechless. For years, I believed he still worked as an accountant, that the late nights, the smell of cigarettes and liquor were just a man trying to forget his pain. But this was something else. "Since when?" I started to ask. "Since your mother died. The accounting office wasn't making it anymore," he cut in, walking to the bar and picking up a half-empty bottle. "A man's got to survive. And this place? Well, it fell into my hands by chance. A client who couldn't pay a debt." He poured some of the liquid into a glass and drank it in one gulp. At first, I just handled the books. Then I realized I could do more than that. What he told me in the following hours was how the Blue Moon, which was once just a highway bar, had transformed into what he called the most profitable entertainment house in Mentone. The words were soft, but the meaning was clear. This wasn't just a bar, it was a roadhouse. "And what am I going to do here?" I asked, feeling my stomach churn. That's when he dragged a high stool and placed it in the darkest corner of the room, from where you could see the whole environment but could hardly be seen. "You will sit here," he said, his voice changing to a tone I had never heard before, almost professorial. "You will watch. You will learn how the real world works, not the one in schoolbooks. You will see what men are really like when no one is watching, how women survive in a society that discards them. You will learn the value and the price of everything." He lit another cigarette and blew the smoke upwards, watching it curl up to the stained ceiling. "The church teaches you to pray," he continued, "but I'm going to teach you to live, to see the truth behind the masks everyone wears." That first day, I sat on that high stool for hours while Dad explained the operation of the place, how the drinks were watered down to stretch them, how customers were encouraged to spend more than they could, how debts were recorded in a black notebook kept in a locked drawer. The girls, he called them entertainers, started to arrive in the late afternoon. There were about 8 of them, of varying ages, but none seemed much older than 30. Some looked at me with curiosity, others with pity, and 1 or 2 with something that seemed like a silent warning. Ruby was the first to speak to me. She was a thin woman, with dyed blonde hair and eyes that had already seen too much. "Are you his daughter?" she asked, lighting a cigarette while adjusting her tight dress. When I nodded, she shook her head. "Poor thing. He shouldn't bring you to a place like this." "It's work," my father interjected, suddenly appearing behind us. "She needs to learn, just like you learned." The look they exchanged was loaded with meanings I couldn't decipher at the time, but I felt the weight of that exchange, the air growing thick between them. Ruby looked away first, muttered something, and walked off. At night, the Blue Moon came to life. An old, half-drunk pianist appeared and began to play old tunes. The lights were dimmed, creating long shadows in the corners, and the customers began to arrive. Sitting on my high stool in the dark corner, I watched them, men of all ages and types. The rancher in boots and a hat, the public servant in a cheap suit, the merchant with gold rings, the truck driver with calloused hands. By day, they were the respectable citizens of Mentone. By night, at the Blue Moon, they were something else. Dad served me soda in a thick glass so it would look like I was drinking too. "Watch," he repeated. "Learn." And what I learned that first night was unsettling. I saw men who were smiling and cordial during the day transform into greedy, cruel creatures. I saw women who smiled without the smile ever reaching their eyes. I saw exchanges of money, of favors, of empty promises. My father moved through the room like a maestro, conducting a bizarre orchestra. He knew every customer by name. He knew exactly what to say to make them spend more, laugh louder, stay longer. It was a strange talent I had never seen in him before. Sometimes he would bring a customer to my stool. "This is my daughter, Kathy," he would say with a strange pride in his voice. "She's learning the business." The men looked at me with curiosity, some with discomfort, others with something darker that made me shrink in my chair. On one of these occasions, a middle-aged rancher with a face red from drink asked, And what has she learned so far, Frank? My father gave a dry laugh. The most important lesson, Mr. Harrison, that everything in this life has a price. Everything. The man looked at me for a moment too long before being dragged back into the room by my father. When the last customer left, it was already dawn. My back ached from sitting on the high stool for so long. My eyes burned from the smoke. My head throbbed with everything I had seen and heard. Dad called me to the small office in the back. There, on a worn-out desk, he emptied the contents of the cash register. Wrinkled bills, coins, a few checks. Count, he ordered. My hands trembled as I separated the money into piles. I had never seen so much money together. When I finished, he wrote down the amount in a notebook and put everything in a safe embedded in the wall behind a painting. "This is real learning," he said, closing the safe. "Not that nonsense from school. This right here is power, Kathy. It's freedom. It's never depending on anyone." On the way home, we walked in silence through the dark streets of Mentone. The sky was beginning to lighten in the east. I was exhausted, confused, scared, but something inside me already knew that my life had changed forever. "We'll be back tomorrow," he said when we got home. It wasn't a question, it was a sentence. You see, there are moments in life when your childhood doesn't just end, it's murdered. That night, walking home in silence beside him, I buried the little girl who played under the pecan tree. That was my first lesson in survival. He calls it power, but it's a cage. In his mind, he's teaching her survival, but all he's done is replace her school with a prison. That little girl is gone, and Kathy's new education is just beginning. Stay with us to see the dark secrets she's forced to learn from that lonely stool. And so began my education, at the Blue Moon. Day after day, night after night, I sat on that high stool and watched. The stool in the dark corner became my observation post for the darkest side of human nature. And my father, the man who had once spun me in the air, calling me princess, became my guide in that hell disguised as entertainment. The months turned into years. From 1961 to 1963, the Blue Moon became my school, my prison, my daily nightmare. Little by little, Dad expanded my responsibilities. It was no longer enough to just watch and count the money at the end of the night. Now I had to write in the black notebook who drank what, which customers racked up debts, which entertainers were most requested. Eyes open, ears sharp, mouth shut, he would repeat like a mantra as he taught me to calculate profits, subtracting the costs of liquor, food, and the small salary he paid the girls. The worst of it all were the comments he made, always in a low voice, as we watched the roadhouse floor. "See that one over there? The county judge? By day, he sentences men for petty theft. At night, he spends his whole salary here. His wife thinks he works late." Or, "Look at Martin arriving, owner of the biggest furniture store in the city. He goes to church every Sunday with his family, but on Tuesdays, he always asks for Veronica. He pays extra to do things his wife would never imagine." It was as if he wanted to rip from me, one by one, all my illusions about the world, as if he wanted to show me that decency was just a thin mask that dissolved easily with a little alcohol and darkness. The women of the Blue Moon slowly started to get closer to me. I think they felt sorry for the girl who sat alone in the corner, watching everything with increasingly dull eyes. Ruby, the blonde, would often sit with me in the afternoons, before opening time. She told me stories of her childhood in Mobile, of how she dreamed of being a singer, of how she ended up there for lack of options after her husband abandoned her with a young daughter to raise. "You shouldn't be here, little girl," she would say, lighting another cigarette. "This is no place for a girl your age." Veronica, a tall brunette from Florida, would sometimes bring me hidden sweets. "Eat, child, you're too thin," she would whisper, looking over her shoulder to see if my father wasn't around. "That man has no heart, leaving you here like this." Daisy, the youngest, only 20 years old and with eyes that had already seen too much, once gave me a lipstick. "Keep it. One day you'll want to use it," she said with a sad smile. "But not now, not here." Dad didn't like these approaches, but in a way he tolerated them as long as they didn't interfere with my education. Sometimes I would catch him, observing these interactions with a calculating gaze, as if he were assessing how far he could let me interact with the entertainers without me developing some kind of excessive compassion that could compromise my learning. The winter of 1962 was particularly difficult. The cold in Mentone is sharp, and the blue moon with its thin wooden walls could barely keep the warmth in. The nights were long, the room fuller than usual, with men seeking the warmth of alcohol and subdued company. One of these men, Gene Cooper, owned a textile factory in the neighboring town. Tall, broad-shouldered, with heavy hands, he had a reputation for being one of the most difficult customers. The women avoided being alone with him, but the money he spent was too good to be turned down. On one particularly busy night, Gene arrived already drunk, demanding immediate attention. Dad received him as always, effusively, calling him a friend, leading him to the best table. He served him the best drink, which was actually the same, just in a different bottle, and provided him with female company. But Gene was restless, aggressive. "I want something different today, Frank," he said, his voice slurred by alcohol. His small, bloodshot eyes scanned the room and landed on me in my usual corner. "The girl," he said, pointing with his glass. "I want to talk to her." I felt my blood run cold. In almost 2 years of sitting on that stool, observing the worst of humanity, I had still managed to remain somewhat detached, as if I were watching a terrible movie that I wasn't a part of. But now, that man's eyes were pulling me into the scene. Dad hesitated for a second, just long enough for me to see that even he had limits he wasn't willing to cross. "Gene, my friend," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "my daughter isn't one of the entertainers. She's just learning the business. Why don't you choose one of our experienced girls? How about Veronica? A real beauty. And she knows how to do things you can't even imagine." My blood ran colder than Gene's eyes. Veronica. The woman who snuck me sweets, who told me I was too thin. My father was sacrificing her to save me. The man grunted, distracted by the new promise. Dad gave me a discreet signal to leave the room and go to the office. I obeyed, not just trembling with fear, but sick with shame. My heart wasn't just beating, it was breaking, both for myself and for the woman my father had just thrown to a wolf. In the office, I locked the door and huddled behind the desk, pressing my hands over my ears. I listened for hours to the distant music, the laughter, and the occasional shouts, terrified of what was happening to Veronica. That night, I cried. I cried for the little girl I was, for the teenager I should have been, and for the normal life stolen from me. But I also cried for Veronica. I cried because my protection came at her expense. As I wept, a small, hard ember flickered inside me. It wasn't just fear, it was anger. A cold, quiet anger. He could take my school. He could lock me in an office. He could force me to see the worst of the world, but he couldn't make me like him. He couldn't make me believe that sacrificing another person for your own safety was anything but monstrous. Absolute fear is a forge. It can either incinerate you, or it can temper you into steel. That night, in that dusty office, I chose to be tempered, that first spark of anger. It was warmer than the fear itself. That night, crying on the floor of that dusty office, I made a silent promise to the girl I used to be. I will survive this, and I will find a way out. When Dad finally came to get me, it was already dawn. He was tense, the knot of his tie loosened, drink stains on his coat. "Gene is gone," he said without looking at me. "Let's go home." On the way, he was silent for a long time. Then he said abruptly, "This is also part of the education, Kathy. Knowing when to back down, when to push forward. Not every customer is worth the risk." It was the closest thing to protection he had offered me in years. But the incident with Gene Cooper changed something in the dynamic of the Blue Moon. Dad started to keep me more behind the scenes, handling the accounting, organizing inventories, supervising purchases. It was as if he had suddenly realized that his education could go too far. This change brought new horrors. I now had access to the books, the records, the darkest secrets of the business. I discovered that several of the entertainers were trapped in endless debts, loans my father gave them with exorbitant interest rates that they could never pay off. I discovered that he provided protection for small local merchants, charging heavy fees for the service. I discovered that some of the richest and most powerful men in town were in his pocket because of secrets he carefully kept in a locked file. One afternoon, while organizing receipts, I found a yellowed envelope addressed to Frank Thompson, accountant. It was a letter from the law firm Smith & Jones of Chicago, dated 1955, the year Mom died. Driven by a curiosity that overcame my fear, I carefully opened the envelope. The letter mentioned the procedures for the transfer of property according to the will of Mrs. Clara Thompson. There were references to assets and real estate, including the commercial establishment known as the Blue Moon. My world collapsed. The roadhouse hadn't just fallen into my father's hands by chance, as he always claimed. It had belonged to my mother, my sweet mother, who was an elementary school teacher, or at least that's what I had always believed. I quickly put the letter back in the envelope and hid it again among the papers, my heart hammering in my chest. If that letter was true, who really was Clara Thompson? And who was the man I called father? It's a terrible thing to realize the people you trust most are strangers. This secret about her mother changes the entire game. Keep listening, because this discovery is the key to everything that happens next. That was the moment I realized we never truly know anyone, not even the people we love the most. My mother, my hero, she had a secret too. And it made me wonder, is anyone in this world just one color, black or white? The questions multiplied in my head, but I had no one to turn to. I had no friends, no family apart from Dad. The women at the roadhouse were kind, but they were as trapped as I was. And who would believe a 17-year-old girl, the daughter of a roadhouse owner, against an adult man who now had connections with almost every powerful man in the city? I tried once, just once, to talk to Mrs. Eleanor, my old English teacher, when I ran into her at the market. She was kind. She asked why I had left school, said she missed me in her classes. I started to tell her about the Blue Moon, about how my father was forcing me to work there, but the words got stuck in my throat. And before I could say anything meaningful, Dad appeared as if he had a sixth sense for detecting any escape attempt. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said with his professional smile, "what a pleasure to see you. Kathy talks about you all the time. Unfortunately, we have to go now. Commitments. You know how it is." And he dragged me away, squeezing my arm hard enough to leave marks. "Never speak to her again," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Never again try to tell anyone about our business. No one will believe you. No one will help you." That night, locked in the office, he drank more than usual. "You think you can escape?" he asked in a slurred voice. "You think you have somewhere to go? This world out there that you want so badly is just like this one here, only more hypocritical. At least here we're honest about what we are." It was on that night that I knew for sure. I was completely alone. The only person who could save me was myself. So I began to plan in secret. I started saving small amounts of money, hiding it in a false bottom I made in my purse. I began to pay attention to the schedules of the buses leaving Mentone. I studied Dad's habits carefully, noting when he drank more, when he slept more heavily, and most importantly, I started looking for that locked file. I knew it held secrets. Secrets about the roadhouse, about how it had really come into his hands. Maybe even secrets about Mom's death. These secrets could be my only chance at freedom. The isolation was almost complete. The few people who might have helped me, like Mrs. Eleanor, were pushed away by Dad. He controlled every aspect of my life. What I ate, what I wore, who I talked to. The entertainers at the roadhouse were my only companions, but they themselves were caught in their own traps of debt and dependency. At night, lying in my bed, staring at the peeling ceiling, I dreamed of escape. I imagined a life far away from there, a normal life, with school, friends, maybe even a family of my own one day. But every morning, when Dad knocked on my door, demanding that I get ready for another day at the Blue Moon, those dreams seemed more and more distant. The more I learned about the workings of the roadhouse, the more I understood how deep the web of corruption, blackmail, and abuse my father had woven was. And the more I understood, the more I realized that escaping would not be easy. One day, I whispered to myself every night, like a prayer. One day I will get out of here, and when I do, I will never look back. But the blue moon had its claws firmly in me, and its perfume of desperation was seeping deeper and deeper into my skin, my hair, my soul. The night of the 20th of May, 1964, began like so many others at the Blue Moon. The drunk pianist hammering out the same worn-out melodies, the smell of smoke, sweat, and cheap perfume soaking into every floorboard, the artificial laughter of the entertainers, the empty stares, the conversations always the same. I was about to turn 18, and the weight of those 3 years of education bent my shoulders as if I were carrying stones. By that time, I no longer sat on the high stool in the corner. My place was now in the small back office where I managed the books, the accounts, the records. Dad trusted me more and more to handle the practical aspects of the business, while he cultivated relationships with important clients in the main room. I kept my escape plans an absolute secret. I already had almost $1,000 hidden in the false bottom of my purse. I knew the bus schedules to Chicago by heart. I had even managed, with Ruby's discreet help, to make a copy of the office key, where I suspected Dad kept important documents. That night seemed just like all the others until Mr. Davis walked into the roadhouse. He was not a regular customer. In fact, I had never seen him before. He was a short man with narrow shoulders, salt and pepper hair, neatly trimmed, and thin-rimmed glasses. He looked out of place there, with his well-cut suit and impeccably shined shoes. I saw him approach the bar and ask for Mr. Frank Thompson. The bartender pointed to my father, who was chatting animatedly with the mayor in a corner of the room. The man adjusted his tie, took a deep breath, and walked purposefully toward the two of them. From the office doorway, I watched the scene. The man leaned in and said something in Dad's ear. I saw my father's face change. First surprise, then irritation, and finally, something that looked like concern. He apologized to the mayor and led the visitor to a more secluded corner. The conversation lasted less than 5 minutes. Dad was gesticulating, his face growing redder. The man maintained his composure, just shaking his head from time to time. Finally, I saw my father put his hand in the inner pocket of his coat, take out a wallet, and hand some bills to the visitor, who put them away without counting. When the man left, Dad stood still for a moment, running a hand over his face. Then he went straight to the bar and poured himself a double shot of bourbon, drinking it in one gulp. I quickly returned to the desk, pretending to work on the ledgers. Minutes later, Dad burst into the office like a hurricane, slammed the door shut, and started rummaging through the desk drawers. "What are you looking for?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer, continuing to throw papers everywhere. Finally, he found a small silver key inside an envelope and went to the metal cabinet in the corner of the room. He opened it and began searching for something among the hanging files. "Who was that man?" I ventured to ask again. Dad turned to me, his eyes bloodshot, a vein pulsing in his forehead. "A messenger from hell," he answered in a hoarse voice. "From the Smith & Jones firm in Chicago. That's the same name from the letter she found. The past is finally catching up with Frank, and a deadline has just been set. Stay with us to find out exactly what this messenger from hell revealed." My heart leaped. It was the same firm mentioned in the letter I had found years before. And what did he want? Dad pulled a folder from the cabinet and threw it on the desk. "To remind me that in 3 weeks, you turn 18. I remained silent, confused. What did my birthday have to do with that man? With the law firm? "Your mother," he continued, opening the folder and spreading more papers on the desk. "Your dear, sainted mother thought she was clever, leaving a will." My blood ran cold. It was the confirmation of what I had suspected since I found that letter. Mom had left a will, and apparently it had something to do with me and the Blue Moon. "This place," he said, gesturing to the walls around us. "This business was hers, not mine. Hers. The elementary school teacher, the devoted wife, the exemplary mother she owned a brothel. The revelation, though half expected, hit me like a punch to the stomach. My mother, the owner of the Blue Moon, the gentle woman who braided my hair every morning, who told me stories before bed. How? Was all I could manage to stammer. Inheritance? He spat the word out as if it were poison. From her family. This place existed long before I met your mother. It belonged to her father, your grandfather you never knew. A respectable man by day and an exploiter by night, just like all the men you see out there. He took the bottle of bourbon he kept in the bottom drawer of the desk and poured himself another shot. When we got married, she hid it from me, said she had a property that brought in some rent. I was just an accountant, happy to have found a pretty wife from a good family. I only found out the truth when your grandfather died and she had to take over the business. He laughed, a bitter, humorless laugh. I tried to convince her to sell, to get rid of it, but she was stubborn. She said it was a legitimate business that gave opportunities to women who had no other way out, as if it were some kind of charity. He took another swig straight from the bottle. Then she got sick. Those headaches. The doctors couldn't figure out what it was. She was wasting away day by day, and along with her, our money was running out too. The medicines, the doctors, everything cost a fortune. And then she asked me to take over the Blue Moon, said it was our only chance to survive financially. His voice cracked, and for a moment I saw a glimpse of the man he had been before, vulnerable, scared, human. I refused, of course. How could I manage a place like this? Me, a respectable accountant, a family man, but she insisted. She said it was temporary, just until she got better. And I accepted. He looked at me, his eyes moist. When she died, I thought I could finally get rid of this place, sell it, start over in another city. But then the will appeared. He took a document from the folder and threw it in my direction. Read what your sainted mother planned for us. With trembling hands, I took the paper. It was a copy of the will of Clara Thompson. The words danced before my eyes, but I managed to understand the gist of it. The Blue Moon and all of my mother's assets were to remain under my father's management only until I turned 18. After that, everything would be transferred to me. She wanted you to inherit everything, Dad said, his voice now laced with resentment. She didn't trust me to run the family business, thought it would be better to leave it to her dear little daughter. He came closer, leaning over the desk, his face inches from mine. That's why I brought you here when you turned 15. To learn, to understand what your mother left you, to prepare you to take over her legacy. The pieces finally fell into place. The education my father had insisted on giving me wasn't to teach me about the real world. It was to prepare me to take over the roadhouse, to turn me into the next owner of the Blue Moon. I don't want this, I said, my voice firmer than I expected. I never wanted it. He laughed again, that horrible, lifeless laugh. And you think I wanted it? I was an accountant, Kathy. I worked with numbers in a clean office, with respectable people. Your mother turned me into this man you see. And now, when I finally learned how to play this game, when I finally started to make a real profit, that damned lawyer shows up to remind me that in 3 weeks, I lose everything. To you, he snatched the document from my hands and crumpled it. Unless you sign a power of attorney, giving me the authority to continue managing everything in your name. So this was his plan all along, to break her down just to steal her inheritance. He's given her an impossible choice. Sign away her freedom, or what? Stay with us to hear her answer. I'll be the owner, in fact, while you'll just be the owner on paper. Something inside me broke at that moment. A floodgate opened, and all the anger, all the fear, all the repulsion I had stored up for years overflowed. Never, I said, standing up. I will never sign anything. The slap came quickly, stinging my cheek, making my head spin. You will sign, he growled, grabbing my arm tightly. You will sign. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The threat was clear in his eyes. I lowered my head, feigning submission. I need to think, I mumbled. Please. He let me go. He straightened his coat, regaining some of his composure. Think then. You have until your birthday to decide. But remember, this place, these people, this world, it's already a part of you. It's in your blood, just like it was in your mother's blood. There's no use in running away. He left the office, leaving me alone with the scattered papers, the crumpled will, and a revelation that changed everything I thought I knew about my life. I couldn't sleep that night. The image of my mother, sweet, gentle, loving, mixed with the revelation that she owned a roadhouse. The stories she told me before bed, the values she tried to teach me, all of it coming from a woman who owned a place like the Blue Moon. And even more disturbing, my father, the man I despised so much for forcing me to live in that hell, had been dragged there against his initial will. He had been transformed by the place, just as the place was trying to transform me. You see, it's easy to hate a monster, but it's so much harder when you realize that monster was once a victim, too. My father chose his path, but the truth is, the Blue Moon poisoned him long before he used it to poison me. I tossed and turned in bed, listening to the nocturnal sounds of Mentone. Somehow, I knew that night marked a point of no return. In 3 weeks, I would turn 18, and I would have to decide, sign the power of attorney, allowing my father to continue controlling everything, or take over ownership of the roadhouse. Or, there was a third option. The next morning, I woke up with a determination I had never felt before. I dressed carefully, choosing a simple but neat dress, the one Ruby had given me as a gift last Christmas. I combed my hair, looked at myself in the mirror. I was no longer the scared 5-year-old girl who had been dragged to the Blue Moon. I was almost a woman, with eyes that had seen too much, but could still see some hope. When I arrived at the roadhouse, earlier than usual, Dad was already there in the office, wearing the same clothes from the night before, his face marked by exhaustion and alcohol. He looked like he had aged 10 years in one night. "You didn't have to come in today," he said without looking up from the papers he was organizing. "Yes, I did," I replied. "We have matters to discuss." He looked at me, surprised by my decisive tone. "I want to see all the documents," I continued. "The original will, the property records, the deeds, everything." He frowned. "What for? If I have to make a decision in 3 weeks, I need to know exactly what's at stake." A glimmer of hope appeared in his eyes. He thought I was considering signing the power of attorney, that I was starting to accept the family business. Little did he know I was planning my final escape. "The documents are in the bank's safe deposit box," he said. "I can arrange for us to see them tomorrow." I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "And I want to know more about my mother, about how she managed this place." This seemed to disarm him completely. For a moment, the tough, calculating man gave way to the widower who still carried the weight of loss. "Your mother, she wasn't like me," he said softly. "She kept her distance, hired managers, rarely came here. She used the money to help people. She created a kind of fund for the girls who wanted to get out, to start over somewhere else. She paid for their education, set up small businesses for them. This revelation was like a ray of light in the darkness. My mother hadn't just been the owner of a roadhouse. She had tried to transform that grim place into something that, in some way, helped women escape that life. And you ended that," I concluded, not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact. He looked away. "The funds ran out when she got sick, and afterward, I needed the money to survive, to raise you." But we both knew that was a lie. The money had been used to feed his vices, to buy influence, to build his small kingdom of power and corruption. "Tomorrow then," I said, getting up, "we'll see the documents." I left the office with my head held high, an idea slowly forming. I no longer needed to run away like a thief in the night. In 3 weeks, all of this would be legally mine. And then I could do whatever I wanted with the Blue Moon. I could sell it, or transform it, as my mother had apparently tried to do. Or, a third option was taking shape, an idea so radical, so final, that it scared me, and at the same time gave me a strange sense of peace. That night, I dreamed of Mom. She was sitting on the edge of my bed, just like in the old days, braiding my hair. "Be strong, my daughter," she said in the dream. "Do what you need to do." When I woke up, bathed in the faint light of dawn, I knew exactly what I had to do. The 3 weeks that followed were a strange interval of tense calm. Dad and I danced a cautious dance around each other, each evaluating the other's moves, measuring words, calculating intentions. As promised, He took me to the bank the next day. There, in the small room reserved for important clients, I had access to the original documents, Mom's will, the deeds to the Blue Moon, the property records. Everything confirmed what I already knew. On the 10th of June 1964, my 18th birthday, I would legally become the owner of everything. And so? Dad asked as we left the bank. Have you thought about my proposal? I kept my expression neutral. I'm still considering it. He seemed to believe I was leaning toward signing the power of attorney, toward leaving everything in his hands. With each passing day, he became more cordial, almost gentle. He began to teach me details of the business he had never shared before. How to negotiate with suppliers, how to deal with corruptible inspectors, how to keep important clients happy without giving away too much. One day, all of this will be yours, he would say, gesturing around the office. Even if I continue to manage it, you need to understand how it works. I would nod, ask questions, feign interest. And at night, alone in my room, I refined my plan. I didn't tell anyone about the will or my impending birthday, not even the entertainers who had become my only friends. But I began to watch them with new eyes, thinking about what my mother would have done for them, about the opportunities she would have created. Ruby had a 2-year-old daughter who lived with her grandmother in Mobile. She dreamed of saving enough money to open a small diner and raise her daughter with dignity. Veronica wanted to go back to Florida, where she had relatives, but she was trapped by debts she could never pay off. Daisy, the youngest, had a talent for sewing. She did small alterations on the other girls' clothes in her spare time and dreamed of becoming a seamstress. All of them, in one way or another, were trapped at the Blue Moon not by choice, but by necessity, by a lack of alternatives, by debts fabricated by my father to keep them dependent. One night, about a week before my birthday, I went to the office after the roadhouse had closed. I used the key I had secretly made. I needed to check one more thing. The safe embedded in the wall, hidden behind a faded painting, contained not only money but also the famous black notebook where Dad recorded the debts. I managed to open it, using the combination I had observed so many times over the years, my mother's date of birth. In the notebook, I confirmed what I suspected. The girls' debts were elaborate fictions, impossible interest rates applied to small initial loans, invented expenses, arbitrary fines for imaginary infractions. Even if they worked for decades, they would never be able to pay what they owed. There was also a list of names important men from the city with notes about their tastes, their weaknesses, their secrets. It was my father's blackmail arsenal, the source of his power beyond the walls of the roadhouse. I took enough money from the safe for what I needed. Not much, just what was necessary. I closed everything carefully and left, my heart pounding, but my mind clearer than ever before. In the following days, I made discreet purchases at different stores in the city. A gallon of kerosene at the hardware store, long matches at the general store, a small, cheap leather suitcase at the travel goods shop, simple and practical clothes at Mrs. Eugenia's store. On the eve of my birthday, I called Ruby, Veronica, and Daisy for a discreet meeting in the small square near the church. It was risky, but necessary. Something is going to happen tomorrow, I told them, keeping my voice low. Something that will change everything. I can't say what it is, but I need you to trust me. They exchanged confused glances. When it's all over, I continued, you will be free. There will be no more debts. There will be no more Blue Moon. What are you talking about, kid? Ruby asked, her eyes narrowed with suspicion. I took 3 envelopes from my bag. In each one, there was money, not a lot, but enough for a bus ticket and a few weeks of basic expenses. This is for you. For a new beginning. Where did you get this? Daisy asked, her eyes wide at the sight of the money. From where it should have come from a long time ago, I replied. I only ask one thing in return. Tomorrow night, don't come to work. Stay far away from the Blue Moon and be ready to leave. They looked at me as if I had gone mad. Maybe I had, but it was a lucid, calculated, necessary madness. Trust me, I repeated. Please. After some hesitation, they each took their envelope. Ruby held my hand for a moment. Be careful, Kathy, she said, her eyes full of an understanding that went beyond my words. Whatever you're planning. I squeezed her hand back. I'm just cleaning up my mother's house, I whispered. Ruby looked at me, a long, sad, knowing look. Then she nodded once, a sharp, definite movement. You do it, child, she said, her voice rough. Some places aren't meant to be saved. They're meant to be cleansed. Go, and don't you ever look back. Her words were the blessing I didn't know I needed. She wasn't just a fellow prisoner. She was my first ally. This is the moment Kathy stops being a prisoner and becomes a liberator. She's not just saving herself, she's honoring her mother's true legacy. But freeing the women is only step one. Step two is making sure no one can ever be trapped there again. Keep listening. On the morning of my birthday, the 10th of June 1964, I woke up before dawn. I lay in bed for a moment, looking at the familiar ceiling of my room, aware that it would be the last time I would see it. I dressed carefully, choosing practical, comfortable clothes for travel. I put only the essentials in the small suitcase, a few items of clothing, a photograph of my mother, the lipstick Daisy had given me years before, and the documents proving my identity and my ownership of the Blue Moon. Dad was already awake when I left the room. He was in the kitchen making coffee, something he hadn't done in years. There was even a small cake on the table with a single candle. Happy birthday, he said with a forced smile. 18 years old. A woman now. I thanked him, feeling a strange lump in my throat. Despite everything, despite all the harm he had done to me, he was still my father. The man who, before Mom's death, had spun me in the air, calling me princess. We had coffee in silence, the untouched cake between us. Well, the day is finally here, he finally said. As of today, you're officially the owner of the Blue Moon. I nodded without saying anything. And what about the power of attorney? He asked, trying to sound casual, but with a note of anxiety in his voice. Have you decided? I looked at him for a long moment, assessing the man he had become. Thin, prematurely aged, with eyes that had seen and caused too much suffering. Let's talk about it tonight, I finally replied. At the Blue Moon. I want to celebrate my birthday there. After all, it's mine now, isn't it? Something flashed in his eyes, distrust, perhaps, but then it was gone, replaced by that calculating gleam I knew so well. Of course, he said, getting up to wash his cup. It will be a special night. I spent the day wandering through the town, silently saying goodbye to Mentone. I visited the old school where I had studied until I was 15. I passed by Mrs. Eleanor's house, without the courage to knock on the door. I sat for a while in the town square, watching children play, people bustling about their daily chores, the normal life that had been denied to me. Around 5 p.m., I took my small suitcase, which I had hidden behind a bush in our yard, and left it in a rented locker at the bus station. The last bus to Chicago left at 11:30 p.m. I intended to be on it. When I arrived at the Blue Moon, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky an intense red that seemed like an omen. Dad was already there, checking the inventory at the bar, giving instructions to the bartender. He smiled when he saw me. Here's the birthday girl. I smiled back, trying to look natural. Have any of the girls arrived yet? I asked, knowing the answer. He frowned. That's strange. Not yet. Ruby is usually the first. They must be running late. I nodded, relieved to know they had followed my advice. I walked through the empty room, running my hand over the surface of the tables, the backs of the chairs, the silent piano, memorizing every detail for what was to come. Are we opening later today? I asked casually. I was thinking of waiting until 8, he replied. Give the girls time to arrive, get everything ready. After all, it's a special night. Yes, I agreed. Very special. I went to the office and closed the door. From my bag, I took out the papers I had prepared during the week, documents officially releasing all the entertainers from their debts, records transferring small amounts of money to each of them, enough to restart their lives elsewhere. I signed each one with my full name, now legally valid since I was of age and the owner of everything. I put the documents in separate envelopes, each with one of the women's names on it. I placed them all in a folder and hid it in a secret compartment of the desk, a space I had discovered years before that not even my father knew about. When I left the office, it was already past 7. The main room was still empty, with no sign of the entertainers. Dad was pacing back and forth, visibly irritated. "Where are these damn women?" he grumbled. "They've never all been late at the same time." "Maybe they're not coming," I suggested gently. He looked at me suspiciously. "What do you know about this?" I shrugged. "Nothing. Just a feeling." He came closer, his eyes narrowed. "You talked to them, didn't you? What are you plotting, Kathy?" I kept my expression neutral. "Why don't you open the bar? The customers will start arriving soon. I'll stay at the register today. After all, I'm the owner now, aren't I?" He hesitated, clearly torn between suspicion and the need to maintain appearances. "To continue the game until I signed the power of attorney." "Fine," he said finally. "I'll go get everything ready." While he opened the bar, turned on the lights, and put a record on the jukebox, I methodically went through the back of the roadhouse, checking every room, every exit. The pianist arrived, already half drunk as usual, and started playing the same old tunes. At 8 o'clock sharp, the first customers began to arrive. Men of various ages and types, all surprised to find the room without the usual entertainers. "Where are the girls?" one asked, patting my father on the shoulder. "They'll be here soon. They'll be here soon," he would reply, his smile forced, his eyes searching for me around the room. Around 9, the blue moon was almost full, but still without any of the women. The customers were getting more and more restless, drinking more, talking louder. Dad circulated among them, trying to calm them down, promising that the attractions would arrive soon. At 10, I went to the bar and poured myself a Coke. It was the first time I had allowed myself a drink without asking permission, a small act of independence that symbolized so many things. "We need to talk," Dad said, suddenly appearing beside me. I nodded and followed him to the office. As soon as he closed the door, he exploded. "What did you do?" he shouted. "Where are the girls? The customers are furious." "They're not coming," I replied calmly. "They're free now. All of them." "What are you talking about?" "No one is free. They have debts, contracts, obligations." "Not anymore," I said, keeping my voice firm. "I freed them. And I freed myself too." His face turned red with fury. "You think you can just destroy everything I've built? You think you can?" "You didn't build this," I interrupted. "It was my mother. And before her, my grandfather. You just twisted it, corrupted what was theirs." He advanced, raising his hand as if to strike me again, but something in my gaze stopped him. "I am the owner now," I said with a calm I didn't know I possessed. "And I've decided that the blue moon closes tonight. For good." For a moment, he seemed lost, confused, as if he didn't recognize the woman in front of him. Then his face contorted into a mixture of fury and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice almost pleading. "This place is all we have. It's our security, our livelihood. Without it, what will we be?" "We'll be free," I replied simply. He laughed, that bitter, humorless laugh I hated so much. "Free for what? To starve? To beg on the streets? The world out there isn't like your school books, Kathy. It's cruel, ruthless. I know exactly what the world is like," I retorted. "You made sure to teach me, remember? But I also know there's more to the world than this place, than this life you chose." He backed away, running a hand over his tired face. "What do you want then? To sell it? Turn it into something else? A restaurant? Maybe a respectable inn?" There was a mocking tone in his voice. "I don't want to sell it," I replied. "I want to end it. Completely." I took the office key from my bag. The original, not the copy I had made years ago. "The customers are waiting," I said, walking toward the door. "Go attend to them. It's your last night as the master of the blue moon. Enjoy it." Before he could answer, I left and locked the door, turning the key in the lock. I heard his muffled shouts, his fists pounding on the wood, but I kept walking, determined. In the main room, the customers were already quite agitated from the drink and the absence of the women. Some were threatening to leave, others demanding explanations. I got up on the small stage where there were sometimes musical performances. I tapped a glass with a spoon to get their attention. Gradually, the noise subsided, and all eyes turned to me. "Gentlemen," I began, my voice clear and steady, "thank you for coming tonight. Unfortunately, I must inform you that the Blue Moon is closing its doors permanently." There was a moment of stunned silence, followed by a chorus of protests. "It's not a joke. As some of you may know, today is my 18th birthday, and according to my mother's will, Clara Thompson, I become the legitimate owner of this establishment. And my first and last decision as owner is to close it. For good." The faces in front of me registered varying degrees of surprise, confusion, and indignation. Some of the older men exchanged worried glances, those whose names and secrets were in my father's black notebook. "I ask you to finish your drinks and leave in an orderly fashion," I continued. "The doors of the Blue Moon will not open again." I stepped down from the stage amidst a tumult of voices. Some customers were already heading for the exit, grumbling. Others were protesting more vehemently, demanding to speak with my father. "Mr. Thompson is unavailable at the moment," I replied to one of them. "He will join you shortly." Outside, I went to the bar where the barrels of bourbon and whiskey were lined up. With deliberate movements, I opened the taps of each one. The liquid began to spill, forming puddles on the worn wooden floor. "What are you doing?" The bartender, Silas, shouted, trying to close the taps. "Go, Silas," I told him. "Take your pay in the envelope on the register and leave. There's nothing left for you here." He looked at the envelope, looked at me, looked at the alcohol spilling on the floor, and decided it wasn't worth arguing. He took the money and headed for the door. The last customers were leaving, some casting furious glances in my direction, others simply confused. The pianist, Arthur, who had watched everything with a perplexed expression, got up unsteadily. "And I, miss? Should I leave too?" I handed him his envelope. "Yes, Mr. Arthur. Your music will no longer be needed here." When everyone had left, I locked the main door from the outside. I could still hear my father's shouts coming from the office, but they seemed distant and unreal, as if from another world. I walked slowly around the perimeter of the roadhouse. The night was clear, starry, the air cool as is typical of Mentone in June. I took the pack of long matches and the pack of cigarettes I had bought earlier from my bag. I, who had never smoked in my life, lit a cigarette with surprisingly steady hands. The taste was bitter, the smoke scraped my throat, but I didn't care. It was symbolic. I went back to the front of the Blue Moon and looked at the faded sign one last time. So many tears, so many shattered lives, so many lost dreams in that place. I took one last drag from the cigarette and flicked it to the ground, directly onto the puddle of alcohol that had already seeped out from under the door. This is it. The final lesson her father taught her was how to burn his world to ashes. Some prisons can't be unlocked, they have to be cleansed by fire. Stay with us for the powerful conclusion to Kathy's story. The flames shot up instantly, licking the dry wood of the facade as if they were hungry. I took a step back, watching the fire spread with astonishing speed. For a moment, I thought of my father locked in the office, but I knew there was a back exit. He used it frequently to escape creditors or furious husbands, and the office had a window large enough for a man to jump through. The flames now lit up the night, attracting the attention of nearby residents. I heard distant shouts, people calling for water, for help. It was time to leave. I walked quickly, away from the fire, toward the bus station. I didn't look back once, but I could feel the heat of the flames, even from a distance. I could hear the crackling of the yielding wood, the sound of breaking glass. When I got to the station, it was 11:15 p.m. The last bus to Chicago left at 11:30 p.m. I had just enough time. I retrieved my suitcase from the locker and bought a one-way ticket with the money I had set aside. Chicago would be just the beginning. From there, I would go wherever destiny took me. Sitting on the bus as it pulled away from Mentone, I could see the glow of the fire against the night sky. The Blue Moon was being consumed by flames, taking with it the debt notebooks, the records of dirty secrets, and the smell of desperation that had permeated my soul for so many years. And as the bus continued down that dark highway, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. A feeling that maybe I could rebuild my life, that I could be more than Frank Thompson's daughter, more than the heiress of the blue moon. That night, as the purifying flames consumed my past, I, Kathy Thompson, finally began to live. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying that fire was a good thing, but I know that some prisons can't be escaped through the front door. Sometimes, you have to burn your own past to the ground to make room for a new dawn. When the bus arrived in Chicago the next morning, I was a different person, not just legally an adult, but transformed by the fire I had left behind. Both the literal fire that consumed the blue moon and the inner fire that had forged my determination. The city of Chicago welcomed me with its characteristic hustle and bustle, so different from the quiet Mentone. The wide streets, the tall buildings, the constant movement of people and vehicles, it all seemed intimidating to a young woman from a small town, but I was determined not to be scared. With the money I had saved, the secret savings of years plus what I had taken from the safe on the last night, I rented a simple room in a boarding house for young women in the Lincoln Park neighborhood. It was a modest but clean place, run by Mrs. Carmichael, an elderly woman with watchful eyes who demanded decorum and respect among her tenants. "Where are you from, girl?" she asked, as she showed me the small room on the second floor. "From Mentone, Alabama," I replied. "I came to Chicago to find work and study." She looked me up and down, evaluating me. "You're alone? No family?" I hesitated for a moment. "My parents passed away," I finally said, deciding it was simpler. And in a way, it wasn't untrue. I have no one else in Mentone. Something in my eyes must have touched the old woman's heart, because her severe expression softened a bit. "Well, here we're all alone in one way or another," she said. "But we form a sort of family. We look out for each other. As long as you respect the house rules, no male visitors. Be in by 10 p.m., help with the common chores, you'll be welcome." I thanked her, and began to unpack my small suitcase, arranging my few clothes in the worn wooden dresser. When Mrs. Carmichael left, I sat on the narrow bed and allowed myself to take a deep breath for the first time in a long time. I was far from Mentone, far from the blue moon, far from my father. A sense of lightness washed over me, immediately followed by a weight of uncertainty. What would I do now? How would I survive? What direction would my life take? In the following days, I bought newspapers and scoured the job listings. With my education interrupted at 15, my options were limited. But I had other skills. I knew how to do accounts accurately, write correctly, organize records, and more importantly, I had learned to read people, to understand their motivations, their desires, and their fears. A week after arriving in Chicago, I got a job as a clerk in a small bookstore in the city center. The owner, Mr. Samuel, was a cultured and kind man who valued a love for books more than formal credentials. When I explained that my education had been interrupted but that I would love to learn more, he looked at me over his glasses and said, "The best university is right here around you. Thousands of books, thousands of brilliant minds, waiting to talk to you through the pages." It was at the Athena bookstore that I began my true education. In the intervals between helping customers and organizing shelves, I devoured books, novels, biographies, essays, poetry. I discovered worlds I never imagined existed. I met people through the pages, people who had suffered, fought, triumphed, exactly as I was trying to do. But there were still shadows. At night, in the silence of my small room at the boarding house, I would sometimes wake up in a cold sweat, the smell of the blue moon returning to my nostrils, the sound of my father's screams echoing in my ears. In my nightmares, the fire I had started didn't just consume the roadhouse, but it spread, swallowing all of Mentone, my entire childhood, everything I had been. A few weeks after my arrival in Chicago, I saw a small note in the local paper: "Fire destroys nightclub in Mentone, Alabama. Owner missing." I read those words many times. Owner missing. You might wonder why I didn't try to search. But the truth is, my father had been missing for a long, long time, ever since the day my mother closed her eyes. Whether he escaped that fire or not, The man who had been my father was already gone. The article briefly mentioned that the Blue Moon had been completely destroyed by a fire whose cause was under investigation. It also said that Frank Thompson, identified as the owner, had not been found and that authorities were continuing their search. I felt a tightness in my chest, not of regret, because I knew I had done what I needed to do, but of a deep sadness for the man my father had become, for what we had lost, for what could have been and wasn't. I never knew for sure what happened to him that night. I preferred to believe that he had escaped the fire, as I had anticipated he would, using the back exit or the office window. That perhaps he had taken advantage of the chaos to disappear, to start a new life somewhere else, just as I was trying to do. The months in Chicago turned into a year, then 2. The young clerk at the Athena bookstore became the assistant manager. Little by little, I earned the trust of Mr. Samuel, who began to teach me the aspects of the business, how to order books, negotiate with publishers, organize literary events. It was at one of these events, a book signing with a local author, that I met Professor Albert Miller from the psychology department at Vanderbilt University. "You have a special way with people," he commented, after watching me mediate a heated discussion between 2 customers about the merits of different literary schools. "You know how to listen, how to calm things down, how to find common ground." I thanked him, flattered by the observation. "Have you ever thought about studying psychology?" he asked. I laughed, surprised by the suggestion. "I didn't even finish high school, Professor. College is a distant dream for me." He looked at me seriously. "There are ways. You can get your GED, then take the entrance exams. If you're interested, I can guide you." That casual conversation planted a seed. In the following months, in addition to my work at the bookstore, I started attending night classes to complete my formal education. It was difficult to study after a full day of work, to absorb subjects that my classmates had learned gradually over the years. But there was a hunger in me, a desire to understand, to grow, to transform the painful experiences of my past into something meaningful. In 1968, at the age of 22, I took the entrance exam for Vanderbilt. Against all odds, I was accepted into the psychology program. Professor Miller, who had become a mentor and friend, was the first to congratulate me. "You have an innate understanding of human nature," he said. "Now you will acquire the tools to transform that understanding into concrete help for those who need it." The university years were intense, challenging, and deeply rewarding. I studied concepts and theories that seemed to give names and structure to things I already intuited through my own experiences: resilience, defense mechanisms, trauma, and its overcoming all of it resonated deeply with me. In my final year, during a supervised clinical internship, I worked with a young woman who had been abused by her stepfather. As I listened to her tell her story, the betrayal, the fear, the guilt, the repressed anger, I felt an echo of my own past. Not the same type of abuse, but the same feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in a situation over which I had no control. At that moment, I realized that my own story, however painful it had been, gave me a unique capacity for empathy. I didn't need to share the details of my past, and in fact, I rarely did, but the deep understanding of human suffering was there, informing my practice, my approach, my ability to be truly present for those who sought help. After graduating, I worked for a few years in a community clinic in Chicago, primarily serving women and children in vulnerable situations. The work was arduous, often frustrating, but incredibly meaningful. It was during this period that I started to hear news from some of the entertainers from the old Blue Moon. Ruby, who had used the money I gave her to move to Mobile and reunite with her daughter, managed to open a small diner, as she had always dreamed. She wrote me a letter addressed to the Athena bookstore, the only address of mine she knew, thanking me for her freedom and telling me about her new life. Daisy, the youngest, had gone to Florida, where she was working in a clothing store and studying sewing in her spare time. She also wrote to me, her letter full of youthful enthusiasm and plans for the future. I never heard directly from Veronica again, but Ruby mentioned in her letter that she had returned to Florida to be with her family. I hoped she had found some peace, some new beginning. As for my father, the mystery persisted. In the first few years after the fire, I would occasionally look for news of him in Mentone newspapers or discreetly ask people who came from the town. I never found anything conclusive. It was as if Frank Thompson had vanished along with the blue moon, consumed by the same fire that had set me and the entertainers free. In 1975, at the age of 29, I received an invitation to work at a clinic in Gulf Shores, Alabama. The change felt right. I had been in Chicago for over a decade, and while I loved the city that welcomed me, I longed for the peace of the ocean. It felt like the new start I needed, a place to finally settle down. It was in Gulf Shores that I met Paul, a history professor at the local university. He was a widower with a young daughter, Emily. We met at a seminar on childhood trauma. He was seeking guidance on how to help his daughter cope with the loss of her mother. Our relationship began professionally, evolved into a friendship, and gradually into something more. Paul was kind, intelligent, patient, and Emily was a sweet, resilient child who won me over immediately. When Paul asked me to marry him a year later, I felt a mixture of joy and terror. Joy at the possibility of a family, of a true love. Terror because of the secrets I carried, the past I had never fully shared with anyone. "I need to tell you some things," I told him one night after Emily had gone to bed. "About my past, about who I am." He held my hands and looked into my eyes. "I love who you are now, Kathy. What came before helped shape this extraordinary woman who is in front of me. But it doesn't define you." "Still," I told him, "not everything." There were details I would never be able to verbalize, but enough. About my father, about the blue moon, about how I had run away, about the fire. When I finished, there were tears in his eyes, but also a deep understanding. That's the moment the whole world stops. She's finally told him everything. The fire, the blue moon, all of it. After a lifetime of secrets, she's laid her soul bare. Will this good man see the monster her father tried to create, or the survivor she fought to become? Don't go anywhere. You're about to hear his answer. "You survived," he said simply. "And you didn't just survive. You transformed your pain into the ability to help others. How could I not love you? Even more so for that." We married in 1,977 inches, a simple ceremony with just a few close friends. Emily, then 8 years old, was our flower girl, radiant in her light blue dress. Our life together in Gulf Shores was quiet, loving, filled with the small daily joys I had never imagined I could have. Paul and Emily brought a lightness to my existence that counteracted the weight of the memories I still carried. The house we rented and later bought was just a few blocks from the sea. From our porch, we could see the ocean and hear the waves on calm nights. Emily, then a teenager, adapted quickly to life in the small town, making friends at the local school and becoming actively involved in the community. Paul found satisfaction in teaching history to students who were often the first in their families to attend college. And I found my true purpose in community mental health work. I started support groups for women, victims of violence, child abuse prevention programs, self-esteem workshops for teenagers. I used everything I had learned, not just in college, but through my own experiences, to create safe spaces for healing and growth. As the years passed, the memories of the blue moon and my father never completely disappeared, but they lost their power over me. The nightmares became rarer. The smell of smoke and desperation was gradually replaced by the scent of the sea breeze, of fresh coffee in the mornings with Paul, of orange cake on Sunday afternoons with Emily, and later, with my grandchildren. In 2005, at the age of 59, I officially retired, although I continued my volunteer work at the community center. Emily, now an adult and a mother of 2, had become a teacher like her father. Paul and I began to dedicate more time to small trips around the country, to reading, to walking on the beach on sunny mornings. It was during one of those walks in 2008 that Paul suffered a massive heart attack. Despite the doctor's best efforts, he left us. His departure left an immense void, but it did not destroy me. The years with him had taught me that love is stronger than loss, that life goes on even after the greatest sorrows. Emily and my grandchildren, Sophie and Caleb, became my great support. I remained active, involved in the community, determined to live each day to the fullest. honoring Paul's memory and the second chance that life had given me. In 2020, when the pandemic hit the United States, I had to adapt again. The in-person meetings at the community center were suspended. Emily and the grandchildren, worried about me, insisted that I stay safe at home. It was my granddaughter Sophie, then 24, and a communications student, who suggested a solution. "Grandma, why don't you share your stories online? You have so many things you've lived through, so much wisdom to pass on." At first, the idea seemed absurd. Me, a woman in my mid-70s, recording videos for the internet. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. I wouldn't have to tell everything. There were parts of my story that were still too difficult to share openly. But I could convey the lessons, the hope, the possibility of starting over, even after the darkest experiences. And so, with Sophie's patient help, I began to record short videos on the porch of my house in Gulf Shores. At first, they were just reflections on life, simple advice, light stories from my childhood. As I gained confidence, I began to tackle deeper subjects: resilience, overcoming trauma, the importance of breaking cycles of abuse, always with care, always with respect for the listeners, but also with the honesty that comes from someone who has lived and survived. To my surprise, the videos began to attract followers. First dozens, then hundreds, eventually thousands. People of all ages, from all corners of the United States, found comfort and inspiration in the words of a white-haired old lady sitting on her porch by the sea. "Your stories saved me," a young woman wrote in the comments. "They made me believe that I can also escape my situation, that I can build a better life." Those comments touched my heart deeply. The girl who had been forced to sit on that high stool in the dark corner of the blue moon, observing the worst of humanity, was now helping other people find light in their own darkness. Today, at 79, I look out at the sea from Gulf Shores and think about how unpredictable life is, how strong we can be when we have no choice, how much we can grow through pain when we find the right path. I still don't know what happened to my father on that night of the 10th of June, 1964. Sometimes I imagine he managed to escape, that he found some form of redemption in his final years. Other times I fear he perished in the fire, the final victim of the cycle of destruction he himself helped to perpetuate. But I have learned to live with that uncertainty, just as I have learned to live with the invisible scars that the blue moon left on me. I don't let them define me, but I don't deny them either. They are part of who I am, part of the strength I discovered in myself when I lit that match and let the purifying flames consume my past. And now, here I am, sharing a piece of this journey with you, not to evoke pity or admiration, but to say to every person who is going through their own personal hell, you can survive, you can escape, you can transform even the most terrible experiences into something that will one day help others find their own path to the light. Because life, my dears, even in its darkest moments, always holds the possibility of a new dawn. My father wanted me to believe the world runs on desperation, that we are all just prisoners of circumstance. But he was wrong. The real lesson I learned in the darkness of the blue moon is this: you do not have to accept the prison others build for you. You have the right, and you have the power, to burn it to ashes. Never let anyone, whether family or society, define your reality or your limits. There are so many more truths that need to be brought to light. Please subscribe, because every story shared is a new spark. Be your own fire.